Hello and welcome back to our Winter's Tale. This evening's tale is part 2 of The Hunter's Wife by Anthony Doerr. He was 30 years old, twice her age. She smiled at him, leaned over from the days in the red glow of the emergency lights and shook her head. "Show's over," she said. In his pickup, he trailed the magician's van through the blizzard to her next show, a library fundraiser in Butt. The next night he followed her to Missoula. He rushed to the stage after each performance. "Just eat dinner with me," he'd plead. "Just tell me your name." It was hunting by persistence. She said yes in Bozeman. Her name was plain, Mary Roberts. They had rhubarb pie in a hotel restaurant. "I know how you do it," he said. "The feet in the box are dummies. You hold your legs against your chest and wiggle the dummy feet with a string." She laughed. "Is that what you do? Follow a girl from town to town to tell her her magic isn't real?" "No," he said, "I hunt." "And when you're not hunting?" "I dream about hunting." She laughed. "It's not funny," she said. You're right, she said, and smiled. "It's not funny. I'm that way with magic. I dream about it, even when I'm not asleep." He looked into his plate, thrilled. He searched for something he might say. They ate. "But I dream bigger dreams, you know," she said, after she had eaten 2 pieces of pie carefully with a spoon. Her voice was quiet and serious. "I have magic inside of me. I'm not going to get sawed in half by Tony Vespucci all of my life." "I don't doubt it," the hunter said. "I knew you'd believe me," she said. But the next winter, Vespucci brought her back to Great Falls and sawed her in half in the same plywood coffin. And the winter after that, both times after the performance, the hunter took her to the Bitterroot Diner, where he watched her eat 2 pieces of pie. The watching was his favourite part. A hitch in her throat as she swallowed, the way the spoon slid cleanly out from her lips, the way her hair fell over her ear. Then she was 18, and after pie, she let him drive her to his cabin, 40 miles from Great Falls, up in the Missouri and then east into the Smith River Valley. She brought only a small vinyl purse. The truck skidded and sheared as he steered it over the unploughed roads, fishtailing in the deep snow, but she didn't seem afraid or worried about where he might be taking her, about the possibility that the truck might sink in a drift, that she might freeze to death in her pea coat and glittery magician's assistant dress. Her breath plumed out in front of her. It was 20 degrees below zero. Soon the roads would be snowed over, impassable until spring. At his one-room cabin with furs and old rifles on the walls, he unbolted the door to the crawl space and showed her his winter hoard. 100 smoked trout, plucked pheasants and venison quarters hanging frozen from hooks. "Enough for 2 of me," he said. She scanned his books over the fireplace. A monograph on grouse habits, a series of journals on upland game birds, a thick tome titled simply Bear. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Would you like to see something?" He gave her a snowsuit, strapped her boots into a pair of leather snowshoes, and took her to hear the grizzly. She wasn't bad on snowshoes, a little clumsy. They went creaking over wind-scalloped snow in the nearly unbearable cold. The bear denned every winter in the same hollow cedar, the top of which had been shorn off by a storm. Black, 3-fingered and huge, in the starlight it resembled a skeletal hand thrust up from the ground, a ghoulish visitor scrabbling its way out of the underworld. They knelt. Above them the stars were knife points, hard and white. "Put your ear here," he whispered. The breath that carried his words crystallised and then blew away. They listened face to face, their ears over a woodpecker hole in the trunk. She heard it after a minute, tuning her ears into something like a drowsy sigh, a long exhalation of slumber. Her eyes widened. A full minute passed. She heard it again. "We can see him," he whispered, "but we have to be quiet. Grizzlies are light hibernators. Sometimes all you do is step on twigs outside the den and they are up." He began to dig at the snow. She stood back, her mouth open and eyes wide. Bent at the waist, the hunter baled the snow back through his legs. He dug down 3 feet and then encountered a smooth, icy crust covering a large hole at the base of the tree. Gently, he dislodged plates of ice and lifted them aside. From the hole, the smell of bear came to her, like a wet dog, like wild mushrooms. The hunter removed some of the leaves. Beneath it was a shaggy flank, a patch of brown fur. "He's on his back," the hunter whispered. "This is his belly. His forelegs must be up here somewhere." He pointed to a place higher up the trunk. She put one hand on his shoulder and knelt in the snow beside the den. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. Her jaw hung open. Above her shoulder, a star separated itself from a galaxy and melted through the sky. "I want to touch him," she said. Her voice sounded loud and out of place in the woods, under the naked cedars. "Hush," he whispered. He shook his head no. "Just for a minute." "No," he hissed. "You're crazy." He tugged at her arm. She removed the mitten from her other hand with her teeth and she reached down anyway. He pulled at her again but lost his footing and fell back, clutching an empty mitten. As he watched, horrified, she turned and placed both hands, spread-fingered, into the thick shag of the bear's chest. Then she lowered her face, as if drinking from the snowy hollow, and pressed her lips to the bear's chest. Her entire head was inside the tree. She felt the soft silver tips of fur brush against her cheeks. Against her nose, one huge rib flexed slightly. She heard the lungs fill and then empty. She heard blood slug through the veins. "Do you want to know what he dreams?" she said. Her voice echoed up through the tree and poured from the shorn ends of the hollowed branches. The hunter took his knife from his coat. "Summer." Her voice echoed. "Blackberries. Trout." Dredging his flanks across river pebbles. "I'd have liked," she said later, back in the cabin as he built a fire, "to crawl all the way down there with him, to get into his arms. I'd grab him by the ears and I'd kiss him on the eyes." The hunter watched the fire, the flames cutting and sawing, each log a burning bridge. 3 years he had waited for this. 3 years he had dreamed this girl by his fire. But somehow it had ended up different from what he had imagined. He had thought it would be like a hunt, like waiting hours beside a wallow with his rifle barrel on his back to see the huge antlered head of a bull elk loom up against the sky, to hear the whole herd behind him inhale and scatter down the hill. If you had your opening, you shot and you walked the animal down and that was it. But this felt different. It was exactly as he were still 3 years younger, stopped up outside the Central Christian Church and driven against a low window by the wind or some other greater force. "Stay with me," he whispered to her, to the fire. "Stay the winter." Bruce Maple stood beside him, jabbing the ice in his drink with the straw. "I'm in athletics," he offered. "I run the athletic department here." "You mentioned that." "Did I? I don't remember. I used to coach track, hurdles." The hunter was watching the thin, stricken man, President O'Brien, as he stood in the corner of the reception room. Every few minutes, a couple of guests made their way to him and took O'Brien's hands in their own. "You probably know," the hunter told Maples, "that wolves are hurdlers. Sometimes the people who track them will come to a snag and the prints will disappear, as if the entire pack just leaped into a tree and vanished. Eventually, they'll find the tracks again 30 or 40 feet away. People used to think it was magic, flying wolves. But all they did was jump. One great coordinated leap. Maples was looking around the room. "Ha," he said, "I wouldn't know anything about that." She stayed. The first time they made love, she shouted so loudly that coyotes climbed onto the roof and howled down the chimney. The coyotes then coughed and chuckled all night like children chattering in the yard, and he had nightmares. "Last night you had 3 dreams and you dreamed you were a wolf each time," she whispered. "You were mad with hunger and running under the moon." Had he dreamed that? He couldn't remember. Maybe he talked in his sleep. In December, it never got warmer than 15 below. The river froze, something he'd never seen. On Christmas Eve, he drove all the way to Helena to buy her figure skates. In the morning, they wrapped themselves head to toe in furs and went out to skate the river. She held him by the hips and they glided through the blue dawn, skating up the frozen coils and shoals beneath the leafless alders and cottonwoods, only the bare tips of creek willows showing above the snow. Ahead of them, vast white stretches of river faded into darkness. In a wind-polished bend, they came upon a dead heron, frozen by its ankles into the ice. It had tried to hack itself out, hammering with its beak first at the ice, entombing its feet, and then at its own thin and scaly legs. When it finally died, it died upright, wings folded back, beak parted in some final desperate cry, legs like twin reeds rooted in the ice. She fell to her knees beside the bird. In its eyes she saw her face flatly reflected. "It's dead," the hunter said. "Come on, you'll freeze too." "No," she said. She slipped off her mitten and closed the heron's beak in her fist. Almost immediately, her eyes rolled back into her head. "Wow," she moaned, "I can feel her." She stayed like that for whole minutes, the hunter standing over her, feeling the cold come up his own legs, afraid to touch her as she knelt before the bird. Her hand turned white and then blue in the wind. Finally she stood. "We have to bury it," she said. That night she lay stiff and could not sleep. "It was just a bird," he said, unsure of what was bothering her, but bothered by it himself. "We can't do anything for a dead bird. It was good that we buried it, but tomorrow something will find it and we'll dig it out." She turned to him. Her eyes were wide. He remembered how they had looked when she'd put her hands on the bear. "When I touched her," she said, "I saw where she went." "What?" "I saw where she went when she died. She was on the shore of a lake with other herons, 100 others, all facing the same direction, and they were wading among stones. It was dawn, and they were watching the sun come up over the trees on the other side of the lake. I saw it as clearly as if I was there." He rolled onto his back and watched shadows shift across the ceiling. "Winter is getting to you," he said. He resolved to make sure that she went out every day. It was something he'd long believed. Go out every day in winter or your mind will slip. Every winter, the paper was full of stories about ranchers' wives, snowed in and crazed with cabin fever, who had dispatched their husbands with cleavers or awls. Winter threw itself at the cabin. He took her out every day. He showed her 1,000 ladybugs hibernating in an orange ball hung in a riverbank hollow, a pair of dormant frogs buried in frozen mud, their blood crystallised until spring. He pried a globe of honeybees from its hive, slow buzzing, stunned from sudden exposure, tightly packed around the queen, each bee shimmying for warmth. When he placed the globe in her hands, she fainted and her eyes rolled back. Lying there, she saw all their dreams at once, the winter reveries of scores of worker bees, each one fiercely vivid, bright trails through thorns to a clutch of wild roses, honey tidily brimming 100 combs. With each day she learned more what she could do. She felt a foreign and keen sensitivity bubbling in her blood, as if a seed planted long ago were only just now sprouting. The larger the animal, the more powerfully it could shake her. The recently dead were virtual mines of visions, casting them off with a slow fading strength, as if cutting a long series of tethers one by one. She pulled off her mittens and touched everything she could. Bats, salamanders, a cardinal chick tumbled from its nest, still warm. 10 hibernating garter snakes coiled beneath a rock, eyelids sealed and tongues stilled. Each time she touched a frozen insect, a slumbering amphibian, anything just dead, her eyes rolled back and its visions, its heaven, went shimmering through her body. Their first winter passed like this. When he looked out the cabin window, he saw wolf tracks crossing the river, owls hunting from the trees, 6 feet of snow like a quilt ready to be thrown off. She saw burrowed dreamers nestled under roots against the long twilight, their dreams rippling into the sky like auroras. With love still lodged in his heart like a splinter, he married her in the first muds of spring.